I am an overanalyzer, which means that whenever I get a question in my head about myself, I will dedicate way too much time and energy to figuring it out and trying to analyze it mentally. Over the years, I filled up dozens of journals and notebooks, and at any given time, I have 3 or 4 ongoing, which means that when I started questioning my gender, I, of course, took to my journals to overanalyze what I was feeling, what I was thinking, and to try to figure out what my gender identity actually was. Added on top of that, I came out in my late 20s, which is later than a lot of people, and so there was a lot more second guessing on top of the feelings that I had, and I honestly spent longer than I needed to trying to figure out what my gender identity was. But in the process, I came up with a set of questions that really helped me to frame how I thought about gender, both at a social level as well as within myself, to figure out what my gender identity actually was. So, if you're someone who's questioning or just generally interested in the concepts of gender, it might be helpful to think through some of these questions. Now, I did not just sit down and answer all of these questions in one sitting and suddenly know who I was, but these were questions I wrote down after the fact or while I was experiencing questions about my gender identity. And over time, these 12 questions were kind of representative of everything that I asked myself, trying to figure out who I really was inside. So let's get started. And the last 3 questions are the most important, but all of the other questions kind of set you up to figure out how you think about gender, how you think about gender roles both in society as well as in yourself, and kind of what your concepts coming into this questioning phase are. So the first few questions are all related to social constructs of gender. So the first question is, what is a man to me? And the second is, what is a woman to me? And of course, the answers to both of these are just people who identify as a man or people who identify as a woman. There's no trait that decides somebody is a man or woman, but we do tend to hold a set of expectations around each of these. Like for men, I generally associate them to be more masculine in appearance, to like wear clothes that are like pants and collared shirts, to have beards and shorter hair a lot of the time, fitting into a culture with other men, and like bro culture, also like fatherhood and needing to be a paternal figure. All of those kind of factor into my idea of what the expectations are of a man. So it's important to understand like the definitions that you're coming in with when you start to think about your gender. And then from there, the key question is, what do people assume my gender is by looking at me or interacting with me? And does that make me uncomfortable? Because for the vast majority of people, the answer is no. If society labels you a man, for most people, that is not a problem. And so if it is a problem, then that means you have something else going on and should explore ideas of gender further. And kind of related to that question is, do I feel restricted by these social expectations around gender roles? And for me, the answer was absolutely yes. And of course, you can still be a man or a woman and defy traditional gender roles, but there were a lot of expectations of men that made me very uncomfortable. And so all of those questions are kind of the framing for any questions about gender identity, because ultimately your understanding of social expectations of gender roles in a lot of ways influences how you perceive your own internal gender identity. So now let's get a little bit more personal and talk about your personal experiences with gender. The first question to answer, if you are considering that you might be gender nonconforming or might not align with the gender that you were given at birth, is just, do I feel an unusual interest in the concept of gender? This is something I saw in myself, like when I started to see people pop up online who were gender nonconforming, and the idea of gender dysphoria started to show up, I would interact with those videos or those posts and start to see a lot more of them. And that was because I just felt this inexplicable interest in that topic, and I didn't really know why. Now it's obvious, but I think this is fairly common. When you are gender nonconforming and like deep down your body knows it, even if your mind doesn't yet, just like discussions about gender can provoke stronger feelings than they would for somebody who is comfortable in the gender that they've been assigned. And very much along those lines, the sixth question I would ask is, do I feel drawn to gender nonconformity specifically? Because as I was questioning, there's kind of a lot of back and forth about, what my identity might be, that I might not be like a cis hetero male like I had assumed, but I didn't know where I would land at all. But something that has been a theme throughout my entire journey is that I've always been more drawn to gender nonconforming presentations and people who are gender nonconforming. So that has been kind of an important indicator of where I might want to end up. From there, we've got to dig a little bit deeper and talk about not just your interests, but your experiences. So I'll give you a spoiler. If you're watching this video, or if you're generally watching videos about gender dysphoria or gender nonconforming identities, you probably have at least some questions about your own identity. So it's helpful to think back to what prompted your questioning or interest. Like for me, it was literally seeing people who are gender nonconforming on social media, which was the first time I had ever really been exposed to people who didn't fit into the traditional binary in any meaningful way. That's what prompted my interest, but is there a specific experience that you can pinpoint as what started your interest in the first place? And also going back to your own experiences, when you look back over all the years of your life, are there specific experiences where you felt uncomfortable with the label that you currently have or that society gave you? There were multiple examples where I felt uncomfortable being labeled a man and associated with masculinity and the culture of like boyhood and of men. And those go all the way back to my childhood. And at the time, I didn't see them as signs of anything other than just like being a sensitive person or being someone who's a little bit more feminine. And so once you have some experiences in mind, the next question to ask yourself is, why does that make me uncomfortable? Like, what doesn't feel comfortable about the label I was given at birth? Why don't I like being associated with that label? For me, I just never felt like I identified with masculinity as a concept. And so whenever people would insinuate any sort of like masculinity or ego or like feelings of strength onto me, that felt uncomfortable. Okay, so we have talked about your concepts of gender as well as your experiences with gender and labels that you've been given in the past. So the last three questions are what really helped me to settle on an identity that felt comfortable and which will hopefully help you do the same. And the first one is, if I could choose, how would society see me? And this doesn't have to be a specific idea, but just like general concepts. So for me, if I could choose, I would not have people that I talk to call me sir. I would not have society see me as someone who's masculine or constantly call me a man. And then the next question is really personal, and I think the most important question you can ask yourself to try to figure out your gender identity. And it's something you should be observing in yourself over time. Like, you can journal about it, you can just really observe when you feel this and look at those patterns over time. But the question is, what gives me that twinge of euphoria? And if you're someone who has questioned your gender, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Like, the things that most people would take for granted or think are normal can have such an impact on somebody who is questioning their gender. So are there certain labels you've ever been called or nicknames that have given you euphoria, that have just like felt right? Is there a certain hairstyle that felt really good when you got a haircut? Are there certain clothes or jewelry you wear that just like feel right for whatever reason? And the list goes on. Like, those are some of the things that are important for me, but it could be like dressing up as a certain character for Halloween, or just like drawing a certain person or playing as someone in a video game. Like, there are a million different ways that this can appear. So just kind of ask yourself, like, what little things throughout my life have happened that have given me that twinge of euphoria? Like, we've talked about the things that are uncomfortable about the label you've been given. So what have you done or experienced that has felt right? And I think once you start to connect the dots between everything in your life that has felt right and wrong, you really get a clear picture of where you're leaning. And once you have that, the last question to ask yourself is, what label or pronouns feel right? Some people, there might not be one, there might be multiple. For some people, there might be none at all. So it's absolutely not a one-size-fits-all question, but like, if you just try on a bunch of different labels, like just say them out loud or write them down. Like, does something give you that twinge of euphoria? Does it feel right? It can change over time, or it might never change. You might never find something that feels exactly right, but just given all of those preferences that we talked about, all the things you've looked at in yourself and know feel right, what label seems to describe those best? So you should always keep in mind that you don't have to pick a label, or you don't have to stick with a label. Like, your experience of gender is your own. You don't owe it to anybody else to have a label that you use. But if there is something that feels right, then you should absolutely try it out. And if it's safe to do so, like, tell other people that you trust and hear them use it and see if that still feels right. So hopefully those questions helped maybe a little bit to understand more about your gender identity and where you land. These were the questions that I constantly just went back and forth on in my head until I came to the conclusion that I was non-binary and preferred they and them pronouns. And regardless of where you end up, as always, thanks for watching.